When Jesus ascended into heaven, he left behind a group of uneducated followers staring at the sky with no political power, no money, and an assignment to reach the entire world. Yet within 30 years, these nobodies hiding behind locked doors stepped out and turned the Roman Empire upside down. They had no army and no institutional influence. They had a promise. Luke, a physician who writes with the precision of a legal deposition, links this new account to his first book through a single strategic word. Luke notes that his former book was about all that Jesus began to do and teach. The Gospel of Luke was Volume 1. Acts is Volume 2, what Jesus continued. Before leaving, Jesus gives the apostles a geographic map for this second volume. He promises they will be his witnesses, starting exactly where they are standing, in Jerusalem. From that center, the mission moves in 3 expanding waves. First through Jerusalem, then across the borders of Judea and Samaria, and ultimately to the farthest reaches of the earth. Luke's narrative follows a risen Christ still at work, now operating through ordinary people filled with an extraordinary spirit. To power this expansion, Jesus uses the Greek word dunamis. While the English word dynamite comes from this root, the concept is different. Dynamite is violent and chaotic. Dunamis refers to an inherent capability. It is the quiet, relentless pressure of a seed that splits concrete. It doesn't rely on brute force, but on being connected to a source. This power detonated in Jerusalem at Pentecost, 50 days after the resurrection. The city was packed with pilgrims from every corner of the Roman world for a harvest festival. Without warning, the disciples began speaking in languages they never learned. These were the native tongues of the international crowd, who suddenly heard the gospel in their own languages. Pentecost is the reversal of the Tower of Babel. At Babel, human arrogance fractured the nations. At Pentecost, divine grace pours downward to reunite humanity through a single shared message. That message was carried by parousia, a word meaning complete freedom of speech. Peter, a fisherman with no formal education, stood before thousands and exercised the right to speak openly, even when it offended the highest authorities. When Peter and John were dragged before the Sanhedrin, the ruling council of 71 religious leaders, the elite were astonished. The apostles had no credentials or rabbinic training, yet they possessed a boldness that came from having been with Jesus. This boldness created a new kind of community called koinonia. In modern usage, this word is often softened to mean casual fellowship, but its roots describe something much more radical. Koinonia refers to a common life. These early believers treated each other's needs as their own. They pooled their resources, opened their homes, and ate together daily. This wasn't a mandated policy or a religious program. It was the organic result of a shared encounter with Christ, turning strangers into a family bound by the Spirit rather than biology. This family identified as witnesses, in Greek, martus. Because testifying to what they had seen was so often met with state violence, this word eventually evolved into our modern word, martyr. Stephen became the first witness to die for his testimony. As he was being stoned, he saw Jesus standing at God's right hand. Luke uses this detail to show that the king notices when his people suffer for his name. The man overseeing Stephen's execution was a religious enforcer named Saul. When Jesus later confronted him on the road to Damascus, he asked, "Why do you persecute me?" He didn't ask about his followers. He identified totally with their pain. Saul became Paul, and the persecution he once led actually catalyzed the mission. The gospel pushed into cultural centers like Ephesus, where the message disrupted the local economy and toppled the influence of the great theater. In Acts, systemic opposition never stops the movement. It only forces the gospel into new territory, proving that suffering can advance a mission rather than end it. Paul's final journey was a calculated move toward Rome, the seat of global power. He traveled despite constant warnings from the Holy Spirit that prison and hardship were waiting for him. That journey included a 2-week storm and a shipwreck that left the crew stranded. These ancient amphorae from the Mediterranean floor serve as a reminder that the promise held even when the ship broke apart. Paul arrived in Rome in chains, a prisoner of the same Caesar whose face was stamped on the empire's currency. It was the ultimate confrontation between an earthly kingdom and an unstoppable message. The book ends without a trial or a death scene. Luke simply records Paul sitting in a rented house, welcoming visitors and preaching openly. The final word of the Greek text is akalutos, unhindered. After 30 years of arrest, shipwreck, and flogging, the message had reached the heart of the empire, and it could not be stopped. Acts finishes mid-sentence because the story of the risen Christ acting through his people was never meant to be closed. It is an open-ended volume 2. The people in Acts didn't risk their lives for a theory. They testified to a person they had met who changed everything. Because the same dunamis described by Luke is available to modern believers, the record is still being written by anyone who decides to speak what they know